So Richard, thank you so much for being with us today. It's an honor to have you and this opportunity to have a bit of a discussion about what's happening in the world and what it means for Utah.
Well, thanks, Miles. Only sorry it's virtual rather than up close and personal, but we'll take what we can get.
Yep, that's absolutely right. You know, as a term member of the Council on Foreign Relations, it's fantastic to have you here in the heartland of the United States, not just on the coasts. And so we're grateful for CFR for partnering with us on our event today and for your participation. Before jumping into the current state of foreign affairs, what's happening in the world, what it means for the United States and what it means for a state like Utah, you know, as I went over your background, you've got such a phenomenal career. And I just, you know, you go through the biography, there's a lot there. And that's just the tip of the iceberg with the contributions that you have made on the world stage over the past several decades. I thought it'd be helpful for our audience to just get a bit more of a perspective on your background, some of the reflections on your career and the people you've had the opportunity to work on. And so the first question, what I'd like to ask is for you to think back on your career up to this point and think about the various senior level positions you've had in several different administrations. Throughout that career, what has surprised you the most? Both some good surprises as well as perhaps some bad surprises.
I think the principal surprise is how little is baked into the cake, how little in life or history is inevitable. But the more you're up close to policymakers, to a president and others, to history being made, you realize how much individuals matter, their judgment, their background, what they bring to the task. And had different people been in their positions at that time, history would have taken a really different road. And what I love about that is the fact that very little is inevitable. It shows what people can do. And when I talk to younger people and students, I often refer to that because it shows their ability to make a difference, to influence things. Yeah, so there's no reason to sit outside, no reason to be cynical or passive. I think there's every reason to get into what Teddy Roosevelt called the arena, because I really do think there's a chance to make a difference, even as a young person. I remember when I was in my 20s in the Pentagon, working there, my memos could still get inside the inbox of a Secretary of Defense. Or when I was in my 30s working for President Bush the father, and spending a ton of time with him during, say, the Gulf crisis after Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. Again, it just gave me a chance not just to watch history, but in a sense to participate in it. And I came away from that again thinking that people can really make a difference.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And you know, I just finished speaking a few minutes ago to the same audience. And one of the points I made is that it's easy to think of foreign affairs and national security as a game of risk. You've got these different countries and different colors out there on the map, and there's these, you know, these inanimate entities, you know, competing against each other. But at the end of the day, we can think about a framework in which countries are advancing their interests, and that's shaping and influencing their decisions. But at the end of the day, it is individuals making choices that's driving what's happening out there in the world. And I think that is an empowering thought, because all of us within our spheres of influence can make choices. And whether or not we're a company thinking about engaging in the world, whether or not we have the opportunity as individuals to travel, to engage with people with different perspectives from different parts of the world, we have a choice. And with those choices, we can then go out and within our spheres, however big or focused they may be, go out there and make a difference. So you mentioned, you know, the leaders that you've had a chance to work with. And, you know, Brent Scowcroft has been a hero of mine for many, many years. He is a native son of Utah. So highly regarded here in the state, grew up in Ogden, Utah, just about 45 minutes north of here. And also Colin Powell is somebody that I think objectively, either on the left or the right, is somebody that you look at that, and I don't know if there's anybody in the United States today that says that he's anything but a preeminent example of what it means to be a leader. Will you share a couple of your thoughts? What leadership lessons did you learn from them and others you had a chance to work with? And how do you think that, what advice would you give as we think about individuals here in the room, you know, making choices? What lessons from these great leaders will help us as we think about the decisions that we each make individually or within the organizations that we're leading?
Like, I was lucky enough to work with both of them and two great friends. Sadly, we just lost Brent. I gave one of the eulogies at his funeral a few weeks ago. He was extraordinary. And Brent was able to, better than anyone I know, be both modest and forceful at the same time. He was modest. He was open to learning, open to listening. Never didn't feel competition with others, but also, even though he was mild mannered and a gentleman and polite, was also very strong in his own views. But he never let his own advocacy get in the way of, in his job, say as national security advisor, making sure the process worked, that everybody else felt they had their chance, their day in court. So there's this ability to be fair, to be open-minded and fair, to me, put him in a position where everybody wanted to work with him. And it gave him, it shows how much influence you can have if you don't abuse or exploit your position of authority. And to me, Brent really lived by that. Cole and I'll tell you one story. It was one day we had the large morning staff meeting at the State Department, let's say the 30 or so senior people. And after everybody cleared out of the room, I said to Cole, I was really surprised how you handled something. There was a problem, a security problem at an embassy abroad, and things had gone badly. And he was very mild mannered. He said, Richard, I learned one thing in the Army. And he said, first reports are never accurate and they're never complete. So don't react the first time a crisis comes to you. Give it time, ask some questions, ask people to assemble all the facts and so forth, and come back in a few hours when they're confident they've got it right. You'll still have time to respond, but you're much more likely to be responding against an accurate backdrop rather than something either incomplete or partially false. And it was a lesson I took to heart, which is use the available time that you have. Say one other thing, because you didn't mention it, but the 41st president, George Herbert Walker Bush. One of the great things about him also is you realize in history, it's not just what matters is what you do, but also what you don't do. And what we don't do as a country, or what we don't do as individuals, can be every bit as consequential as what it is we did do. And his decision, for example, in the heat of victory or progress in the Gulf War, not to march on Baghdad, I thought that showed tremendous wisdom and restraint. And I think history has borne out the correctness of that restraint. And it's just, to me, a good lesson that, obviously we have a bias towards action. On the other hand, what you really want to do is consider all your options, including non-action. And there's no permanent recipe, Miles. Sometimes not doing things can be a mistake. I think, for example, President Obama erred when he didn't act after Bashar al-Assad used chemical weapons, crossing the red line. So inaction can be, I believe, wrong at times. But I also thought that President Bush showed the value of what you don't do. And all I'd say is when any decision maker in business and personal life and government has a range of options, he or she ought to look at inaction with every bit as much rigor and scrutiny as they look at all the choices of doing something.
Yep, and that's listening to you. A few words came to mind: humility, being objective, being strategically patient, and also being good at being a coalition builder. And thinking about building coalitions, as we think about the world of foreign policy and the history over the past few decades, the coalition that you were instrumental in building following Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait is one of the best examples of coalition building in modern history. Right? You had countries from around the world taking advantage of the end of the Cold War to come together in collective action to push back against an egregious act that Saddam Hussein committed against another sovereign country, against Kuwait. Could you give us a little bit of color around that effort to build coalitions? And I'm thinking about it, the sense of, at that point in time, there was talk of a new world order, right? This optimism that we've gotten beyond this bipolar world. We all can come together to take collective action. And if you think about the sentiments, the rhetoric, the action that was taken at that point in our nation's history, and you contrast that with where we are today, and it's hard to find a more sharp black and white contrast where we were then, where we are today. And so are there any lessons there how did you go about building that coalition after Saddam's invasion of Kuwait? And I think any insights or color you have there. And then perhaps if you could contrast that with where we are today. Why is it so hard today to do that type of coalition building on the issues that are facing us? The global issues are facing each country on Earth today, and we'll talk about a little bit more in depth here in a few minutes.
Okay, lots to unpack there. In terms of coalition building at the time, there are some valuable lessons. One is you don't wait until the crisis emerges to start building your coalitions. You've got to invest in relationships. One of the things 41 was good at, the 41st president, is he called people and built relationships when he didn't need something from them. It's like putting money in the bank. Then when he needed to make a withdrawal, he already had a balance. He had some capital there. So when Saddam invaded, that wasn't the first time he called these people. He wasn't the first time he had a discussion about a strategic challenge. So that really helped. Also, you've got to be willing to compromise. When you have somebody like Jim Baker as the point person in coalition building, you've got to decide where to give. You're never going to get 100%, and you've got to decide what are the things you can afford to compromise on and in pursuit of the larger good. And Baker had just tremendous instinct on where to give ground and where to hold firm. And you just had to constantly work it. Really, coalitions are relationships, and you've also got to be willing to tailor them. It can't be one size fits all. You've got to take people's domestic circumstances into account, their realities, what they have to bring to the party. And one of the things Scowcroft, Baker, Bush, and so forth, Bob Gates was there, were good at was not insisting that everybody do this or that, but rather do what's politically possible or where you have a comparative advantage to make a difference. And I think all of this shows that there's nothing the United States can do in the world alone that it does better than it can do with others. Coalitions are force multipliers. The great advantage of American foreign policy is we get up in the morning, we take put our feet on the floor, and there's several dozen partners and allies around the world who are essentially inclined to work with us, be it against a regional challenge or some global issue. And that was the great structural advantage of American foreign policy during the Cold War. Soviet Union had no such countries. It had coerced compliance from the members of the Warsaw Pact, but we had voluntary support and coalitions in NATO and in Asia and elsewhere. So that gives us, again, real partners in trying to encourage some outcome or discourage another one. I think now we're making a big mistake. To see allies largely as competitors is losing sight of the big picture. To think we can do better unilaterally than multilaterally, I think is just flat out not supported by history. Now, don't get me wrong, we've got to forge coalitions that are task specific. I don't think anybody should have in his or her mind this image of the UN General Assembly. That to me is not serious multilateralism. But I think for each challenge we face, we're going to have a different cast of partners. If you want to deal with global health, you may want certain governments, you may want the World Health Organization, you may want the Gates Foundation, you may want several big pharma companies and so forth. If you want to deal with the internet, you may want to have, yes, again, certain like-minded democratic governments. You're probably not going to have Russia or China, to say the least, working with you. But also you may want to have or may need to have some of the IT companies, whether it's the Facebooks or the Twitters or the Google Alphabets, Microsofts or what have you. You've got to cast your coalition and be task specific. And I think that's the future of foreign policy if we're going to be effective.
That's thinking about that process. Right now, I think there's a lot of Americans, a lot of people here in Utah are frustrated at the political dynamics in Washington, D.C. There's so much gridlock. It seems like it's very, very difficult for different factions, different parties, different sides to come together, to go through the healthy debate, to go through the process, but then to come up with a policy and then to go out and execute that policy. On my mind, a lot is this idea of tribalism. We know that we have this increase in nationalism, but at the same time, you have an increase in tribalism. Groups within nations that are fighting against each other, that gum up the policymaking process, that make it more difficult for countries to come up with a coherent strategy to go out and execute that on the global stage. Could you comment a little bit about the political or the policy process in Washington, D.C.? What changes would you advise either a second term Trump administration or a first term Biden administration to make when it comes to foreign policy and how we craft our national security and execute that so that we can be more effective at coming up with a national strategy, bringing together different groups, and then going out and executing a more coherent strategy on the global stage?
One we've just talked about, which is obviously a willingness to work with others around the world rather than unilateralism, forms of effective multilateralism. I also think being on the playing field is better than not. I don't think this pattern of withdrawing from agreements or institutions by and large enhances our influence. I think it diminishes our influence. I understand at times the temptation to withdraw from flawed institutions. My reaction is all the more reason to be there. If they are flawed, then try to fix them. Unless you've got something better to put in its place, I'm not a big fan of leaving the field to others, which just enhances the influence, say, of a China or somebody else whose interests, needless to say, are not our own. Look, American political dysfunction here at home has been a growing reality for decades. It wasn't invented in the last few years, and there's all sorts of reasons for it, from the way we fund our politics, the weakening of national political parties, the way districts are drawn up for the House of Representatives. I think social media has reinforced what you correctly called tribalism, and cable TV reinforces it. When I grew up, there were essentially 3 networks, a couple of nightly news shows, and media was more of a force that brought Americans together. We tended to have common experience. We don't have that anymore. Schools, to me, one of the real problems is, for the most part, we don't teach civics in our schools. In many cases now, we can't agree on what a civics curriculum should or would look like. A lot of young people leave universities after 2 or 4 years and don't have basic understanding of their own democracy or the world under their belts. And I think the real lesson from the last few years is we shouldn't just assume that the resilience and robustness of our democracy is a given. No, I don't know what's going to be the configuration of the Senate, much less the occupant of the White House and so forth. But I just think who's ever elected, let me just put it this way, Miles, you can choose a lot when you run for president. You can choose your running mate. If you win, you can choose your cabinet. The only thing you can't choose is your inbox. And the one thing we all know is the inbox of whoever is the occupant of the Oval Office come January. That inbox is going to be daunting. Array of international challenges, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, climate change, pandemics. Domestically, again, COVID-19, millions of unemployed, racial divisions, political divisions. I don't think we can thrive as a country. We can't even succeed as a country if we don't begin to heal some of our internal divisions. We can't be effective in the world if we're divided at home. We won't set a good example for the world. We have got to revive our economy. We've got to deal with inequality. We've got to make opportunity a reality rather than just a slogan. We've got to improve our public schools, our infrastructure, our immigration system. It's a long list. None of these things will get done if we are politically divided. We've got to somehow figure out how to generate, once again, a spirit of a degree of compromise. I'm not talking about compromising your basic principles, but you never get 100%. We have got to build a willingness and an ability to compromise and politically live despite compromising if we're going to address these national concerns, which are not getting better on their own. Drift is very rarely a successful strategy. And at the moment, I think we are paying the price that we've not tackled a lot of our growing domestic challenges now for way too long.
Yeah. And Richard, that's one of the things I love about being here in Utah. I came back to Utah a couple of years ago. I was working in Washington, D.C. at the National Security Council before that, and a lot of different countries in the Middle East and former Soviet Union. But coming back to Utah has been a breath of fresh air for me, because here in Utah, we know how to come together. We properly apply pragmatic principles, and we prosper because of that. And you see, you know, the left and the right come together, and you get the same political dynamics you get anywhere else in the world, right? You go through elections, and it's tough, and you go through this process. But at the end of the day, as we get to that political process, we end up coming up with solutions. So that process, in my mind, becomes constructive, and that you end up with policies that are better than what either side started with at the beginning. Whereas what I experienced in Washington, I think what we're all observing from afar here in Utah, is that the process in Washington right now is destructive. It feels like if a policy comes out, it oftentimes seems more watered down, less effective than what either side started with. And that's a broken process, and it doesn't bode well for our country. But I guess we all hope that that perhaps Utah can be an example of how you can come together to tackle issues like immigration, like climate change, and taking care of our environment, like balancing free trade with fair trade, and these issues where you see here in Utah that we are taking a very pragmatic and constructive approach to figure out how are we going to engage as a state. So let's.
I think what can I say one thing? I think what you're pointing to is an important point, that often at the state and urban and local level, you can accomplish things that you can't at the national level. And part, I think, is because people working at the state and local level are often held more accountable by those. And all I'd say is that's all good. And I think what you're describing is welcome, obviously. But at some point, how would I put it? It's not enough. Utah can't run its own foreign policy. Utah can't do certain things of scale. And that's why we still need effectiveness at the national level. You know, it was once said by a former Supreme Court justice, it might have been Justice Brandeis, that the states are laboratories of democracy. And it's the states where often you see social innovation and public policy innovation. And I think that's probably right. But then what we really want to see are those innovations that, say, Utah demonstrates. We want to see them get on the highway and go and have other states, or better yet, the federal government pick up on them, because that's the only way to operate at scale in a country of 325 million people. So we still, I think we still desperately need to fix Washington, as important as it is that states and cities do what it is they can.
Yep, absolutely. I agree 100%. Let's spend a couple minutes talking about that presidential inbox. As you think about January, as you think about again, a second term or a new administration coming in, what are 2 or 3 issues on the international landscape that you think will be the most consequential for the United States over the next 4 years?
So let me just give you 3 broad stroke issues and drill down wherever you want.
Okay.
One is how are we going to deal with the return of great power rivalry? You mentioned before the New World Order and all that 30 years ago. Well, we have a toxic relationship often with Russia and an increasingly friction-defined relationship with China. How are we going to be able to figure out, how do we push back with either where we must, be it over their external behavior or their internal behavior, yet still preserve the possibility of limited cooperation where it's in our interest to do so, say with Russia on nuclear arms, or with China on climate, or on dealing with North Korea's proliferation challenge. So I would say that's one set of issues. How do we handle the revival of great power rivalry? Secondly, it's all these global issues, global public health, infectious disease. How do we deal with proliferation? How do we essentially repair the global trading system? How do we try to regulate the cyber domain? It's a long list, terrorism and so forth. But in every one of these areas, there's a pretty healthy gap or unhealthy gap between the scale of the global challenge and the scale of the arrangements in place. And as we were talking about before, if you can't fix it with a single institution, a global universal institution that resembles the General Assembly, what can we do? What can we do with more selective multilateral initiatives to try to narrow the gap between these global challenges and responses? Thirdly, we're going to have to figure out how to do all these things against the backdrop of a country in difficult straits, given COVID, given unemployment, given the divisions politically, racially, what have you. And how is it we tend to our domestic ills without, though, turning our backs on the world? We don't have that luxury. The whole lesson of COVID, in some ways, is what happened in Wuhan didn't stay there. Nothing stays local for long. So we can't basically go to the world and say, hey, we need a few years, we Americans, to sort ourselves out. Give us a little bit of time. We'll fix ourselves. Then we're gonna come back. History doesn't work that way. So we're gonna have to figure out, whoever wins this election is gonna need to figure out how is we address our domestic ills, and they are many and they are real. At the same time, we continue to act in the world. And I think getting that balance right and selling that to the American people will be no small feat.
Yep. And let's drill down on just a couple specific issues that you touched on there. Let's talk about China first. You know, Utah and China have a surprisingly long and close relationship. You know, you had a lot of Chinese rail workers that came to build a transcontinental railroad. Of course, that work was completed in Utah, and a lot of people stayed. And so from very, very early on, you had a strong Chinese community here in Utah. Fast forward several decades, 1930s, Helen Foster Snow was born in Cedar City in rural Utah, went to China, became a very prominent journalist. They captured it and wrote a lot about the communist revolution in China, and became a very prominent person. There are statues of Helen Foster Snow throughout China, and that created this heightened awareness of Utah in China. Several decades later, 1979, Brigham Young University has a phenomenal dance group. They go and they perform the Young Ambassadors across China. At that point in time in China, there wasn't a whole lot on TV. And so for years, you had these reruns of these Utah students performing these Chinese cultural dances. They're played again and again all across China. Again, creating more awareness about Utah than what we deserve as, you know, a small state in the United States. John Huntsman was governor here in Utah in the early 2000s, created Mandarin immersion programs. We now teach of all the Mandarin immersion taught in the United States today, 20% of it is taught right here in Utah. My nephew goes to school in Mandarin. Starting in kindergarten, he learns science and math and other things in Mandarin. So when these kids graduate high school, they're just about as close to being fluent in Mandarin as you can be without being a native speaker. So think about that. A state with less than 1% of the population teaching 20% of the Mandarin immersion. And so you have these strong relationships between Utah and China, and that translates very, very much into our international business, our trade, in exports and imports. And yet at the same time, here in Utah, you have an awareness of the growing concern of Chinese behavior, whether it's you know, how they're treating Uyghurs, whether it's things in South China Sea and expanding their sphere of influence. You know, Taiwan, we have equally strong relationship with Taiwan, very strong Taiwanese community here in Utah. And so you have a lot of growing concern about the challenges with China, the threats to intellectual property, the way that they have, you know, lied, cheated, and stolen in a lot of ways their economic progress. And so you find us in a situation, and I find myself personally in this constant balancing act. How do we think about these people-to-people ties to build them, to strengthen them in a way that makes sense, that binds us together in a way that's productive, while at the same time helping to help companies and others here in the state be very clear-eyed about the challenges and the nature of the relationship. And to be frank, Richard, I don't know if we always strike that balance correctly. And so I would be very grateful for your perspective about what advice you would have for me as I think about how World Trade Center Utah is leading out on this international business development for the state of Utah, and also for the many Utah companies and institutions here that are trying to find this balance between maintaining these strong people-to-people ties, but then taking into account the very real concerns that a lot of Americans have about Chinese behavior that is counter to U.S. interests.
Look, you've described the dilemma or the challenge accurately. And like most challenges or dilemmas, you can't resolve it. At best, you manage it. So I believe in the people-to-people thing, even though it's not a substitute for the government-to-government side. And I think we've got to recognize we're going to have real problems at the governmental level, be it over economic behavior. You mentioned things like intellectual property theft. We're going to have it over human rights, the Uyghurs, Hong Kong, repression within China across the board. We're going to have it in foreign policy over things like the South China Sea, Taiwan, what's happening on the border with India, what's happening vis-a-vis Japan. So, as I said before, what we're going to have to figure out is how do we push back in all of those areas without ruling out the possibility of limited cooperation where it's in our interest to do that. I could think about that with Afghanistan. I could think about it with North Korea. I could think about it on climate. I could think about it on global public health challenges and economics. All this talk about decoupling is so much talk. We can't decouple from China economically. China's too large. It's too integrated with the world. But we are going to have to probably carve out certain areas which are no-go zones, dealing with certain technologies. We are going to have to protect them. So I think we have to understand that. It's not going to be an all or nothing thing economically. It's going to have to become more selective, where, for example, we're not going to use Chinese systems to send and transmit our data, though that would also require our having a viable alternative. We're going to want to become slightly more self-sufficient with some of our supply chains, slightly more careful with certain technologies and so forth. But again, it's not all or nothing. And also, it's not just us. This is something we need to do in concert with our principal economic partners in Europe and in Asia. I think the concerns you raised are not limited to Utah, not limited to the United States. I think they're widely held in Asia and in Europe. So I think we have a lot of would-be partners who want to work with us in coming up with the rules of the road for dealing with this incredibly important country. It's the world's second largest economy. What it does and how it does it will have all sorts of implications, not just for the region, but for the world and for the century. A lot of history is going to be determined by US-China relations. I also argue for the next administration, whoever it is, really making this a priority. We have very little private, serious conversation with China. People use the phrase, from your time in government, strategic dialogue. We haven't had a strategic dialogue with China in years. We do not sit down at an authoritative level in private, working out the rules of the road of this relation. And we had better. There has got to be a better understanding, to use a cliche, of the red lines, say with Taiwan or with technology. We may have to also accept certain realities. When I hear the Secretary of State and others talking about regime change in China, effectively getting rid of the Communist Party, that's not a viable U.S. strategy. We've got to deal with the China that exists, not with the China some might prefer. So I think we have to essentially have a realistic policy toward China. One element of which I would argue is to resurrect a serious, regular conversation between our two governments. So you can have the people to people. Maybe this betrays my own background. That's a complement to, not a substitute for, the government to government.
Yeah, and that's exactly right. The nice thing about here in the state of Utah is we don't have to deal with national security or foreign policy, because that's not our job. That's the federal government's job. And so those very real contentious issues are something that our national leaders need to be thinking about, engaging on. But what a state does, in my mind, that's where you build relationships around trade and investment, education, innovation, these sports and arts and culture and everything else. And those become, that fabric and that ability for the United States to project our soft power through these informal people-to-people ties. But it's not a substitute for the very hard power and the real politic and the diplomacy that has to take place on the national level. And I like how you talk about partnerships. This strikes me as an issue where coalition building becomes increasingly important in the years to come, not only with other states that are like-minded, have the same concerns with China, but also with those with China and on those global issues where we have an alignment of interests. It doesn't have to be all or nothing one way or another. In our final few minutes, maybe rapid fire, two more issues, global issues I think are very important. One is climate and the other is trade. So I'd be curious to get your thoughts first on climate. Just last week, I joined with 150 business, community, and government leaders from across the state to sign the Utah Climate and Clean Air Compact. This is a compact where we all agreed to be stewards of our climate, to work towards adhering to the certain principles that will help Utah's climate be stronger, to do what we can here locally to push back against the degradation of the environment, and also to make sure that we're doing everything we can to support clean air and help our air be cleaner and more healthy as we continue to grow very quickly. Clean air here in Utah is a major issue. And then what I like about this is that if you look at the signatories, and it's people from the entire political spectrum coming together, thinking about a common problem. Obviously, like you pointed out before, what we do here in Utah can be beneficial for us here in Utah, but it's not going to have too much of a global impact. What do you think about climate change? And you got the Paris Agreement, large international multilateral efforts to come together, make commitments. Thomas Friedman joined us last week and talked about the need to use the market to bend things using market-based forces, and he was pretty skeptical of the Paris Agreement and multilateral institutions to be able to combat this. What would be the 2 or 3 courses of action you think are necessary for whether it's government or private institutions around the world to do their part to try to effectuate some sort of collective action towards pushing back and being good stewards of this world that we've been blessed with?
Well, let me just start with your last point. God created the heavens and the earth. And I really do feel we are custodians or stewards, and we have responsibility, not just to ourselves, but to future generations. So this is an issue that I hate that it's become partisan. And it just seems to me it's something that affects all of us. And by the way, it's affecting us now. It's not just a future concern. It's a growing present concern. It's another sign that what happens in the world matters. Climate change is the cumulative effects of what is going on everywhere, whether it's what's going on in Brazil with the rainforest or going on in India or China with the use of coal. I agree, by the way, that the Paris Climate Accord is not the answer. I'm fine with getting back in as a kind of symbolic move, but we shouldn't kid ourselves. There's not going to be a top-down, one-size-fits-all, quote-unquote solution. I think there are going to have to be market things where rather than seeing a responsible climate policy and a growing economy as an opposition, I think increasingly they're in tandem. And I think there's all sorts of areas of green technology or things like automobiles that get higher energy standards and so forth that are responsible for climate and good for jobs. I also think that we're going to have to probably look, and I know you're interested in trade, melding trade concerns and climate concerns. One of the things I would love to see the next administration do is get the United States into what was the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And the grouping, originally it was going to be 40% of the world's economies. We pulled out, and so that was reduced by half. But if we were to do that, one of the reasons I would like to do it is I would like to see that become not just a trade block, but a climate block. And imagine if we could get people to agree saying, if you want to sell cars to us, if they have a CAFE standards, mileage standards that are above a certain amount, you'll have access, say, without tariffs. If, however, the mileage standards are below that amount, you'll have to pay a certain tariff. Or if the goods you want to sell us are produced with certain types of energy sources, you'll have free access. If, however, they're, say, produced with coal, you'll have to pay a tariff and so forth. I think with Brazil, you would go to them and say, look, 1/5 of the global climate challenge is going to be determined by what happens with the rainforest. You have a responsibility to everybody. So here's the deal. If you're willing to act responsibly, we will help you be a custodian of the rainforest. However, if you refuse to act responsibly and meet your obligations, here's the sanctions that are going to come your way. So I don't think there's, if you will, a universal approach to climate, but I think we've got to make it a priority, and we've got to look for various mechanisms to promote the outcomes we want. And again, this idea that somehow if you're responsible on climate change, you don't care about American economic growth, that mindset really needs to change.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned trade, and it's okay. Concluding question from me. It feels like we have this growing protectionist sentiment here in the United States. Here in Utah, trade is so important to our economy. 1 in nearly 4 jobs supported by trade. 85% of Utah's exporters are small businesses, and trade exports generate more than $5 billion in additional revenue every single year for these small businesses alone. So Utah is highly integrated. We've had the highest export growth rate in the nation for the past 2 years. And yet we start to see these protectionist sentiments building up here in the United States and perhaps in other countries as well. What do you think the prospects of this free and open system of trade that's created so much prosperity over the past 75 years? What are the prospects of this system over the next 4, 5, 10 years or so? And what advice would you give to companies here in Utah that are continuing to find ways to go out there to compete and win in the global marketplace?
Look, I am a believer that the upside of trade is far greater than any downsides. I think we have to recognize, though, that certain people do pay a price for free trade, though actually in most cases, what they're really paying a price for is technological innovation, productivity enhancements that eliminate jobs. So one of the things, whether it's in Utah, 49 other states, or at the national level, we've got to be much better at retraining and reskilling our workers. It's inconceivable to me that someone, I say at the age of 22 or 23, if when he or she graduates college, or 18, they leave high school, that whatever they're doing, their first job is going to be their last job. They're going to probably have 10, 15, 20 jobs in the course of their life. What we need to find is a way that, one, they're able to reskill, retrain, and so forth. And two, they have the transitional economic assistance, the healthcare they need. So they have the mobility that's going to be essential to live a 21st century life. So that's one thing. We've got to give people the capacity to deal with the fact that jobs come and go. Now, this trade then becomes really important now, Miles, because coming out of the recession caused by the pandemic, I think trade has the potential to be a real locomotive for American economic renewal. So what we want to have is more free trade. That's why, again, I would love to see the United States in the Trans-Pacific Partnership. I would love to see to expand the USMCA to other parts of this hemisphere. Maybe not exactly the same rules. Maybe there's a modified set of rules for others in the hemisphere. I would like to see the United States, rather than trying to undermine the World Trade Organization, let's reform it. I think it's really powerful, its legal adjudication panel to deal with trade disputes. By the way, we've won most of those we've contested. I think we should look to, again, how to improve that mechanism, how to increase the areas of trade that the WTO covers. I'm open to other regional deals, potentially with the Europeans and so forth. I just think we have to understand that trade is a real positive dynamic for American consumers, keeps inflation down, improves choice. You mentioned all the people who are involved in exports. It's a great job generator. It could help us cope with the environment. And again, I understand there's national security dimensions and we have to protect certain technologies, but we've been doing this for 75 years. We know how to conduct trade and protect American technology. So I don't see it as the kind of choice we have to make. It's also one other thing. I also think there's an important developmental side. If people are worried about China's influence in the world, the Belt and Road Initiative, one of the ways we compete is with trade. This is a way to, in both directions, to increase our connections with the rest of the world, particularly the part of the world which has the fastest population growth over the next 25 years, which is Africa. There's going to be 1 billion more Africans over the next 20 to 30 years. It's an enormous market and so forth. So this is the area where, again, trade can produce so many goods from a humanitarian level to an economic level to a strategic level. And I just think we're short-sighted if we don't take advantage of this important tool.
Yep, absolutely. One thing that I say a lot, and it's true, is that Utah's economic recovery, and the same is true for America's economic recovery, runs directly through global markets. And right now, there is unprecedented disruption in global markets, and there's opportunity for Utah companies and American companies to go out there and to take advantage of that to increase our prosperity here at home and for individual companies and individuals across the country and across our state. So Richard, thank you very much for being with us today. To everybody who's listening in, I highly encourage you to go to CFR's website. They have phenomenal resources there every single day. You can sign up for a daily email to help you to be smart about what's happening out in the world and to participate in this organization that truly is the best organization in the world to serve as a resource to help people better understand the world and the foreign policy choices facing the United States and other countries. Also check out Richard's book, The World a brief introduction. It's a phenomenal primer. It'll help create a framework through which you'll better understand what's happening in the world. And that, therefore, you can make smarter decisions, either as a company, as an institution, and even as individuals. So Richard, thank you for spending so much time with us today. We're grateful, and we look forward to hosting you here in person as soon as we possibly can.
Thanks, my friend. I look forward to it as well. In the meantime, you stay healthy.